Hello, dear friends. Welcome to my basement library, where it's cozy and warm in the middle of an odd winter. This is where I come to read and think and try out new ideas, and especially about stories and how they affect us. I'm happy to have you here with me today for a new series of videos on rootedness and connection through story. In the early days of this pandemic that we're living through, in many places, it was the pandemic itself that brought people together around a shared threat. This quote I read, and it resonated with me in a recent essay by Paul Kingsnorth, a wonderful writer. But what's more interesting is that it wasn't merely the shared threat that brought people together, but it was a shared story. It's a very powerful story, if you think about it, because it embodied a very powerful reality. For many of us, pampered Westerners, for the first time in our lives, we felt the full authority of a state as it locks us down, preventing us from seeing our loved ones, from worshiping together in many places, from going about our daily lives the way we were used to. But many of us still hunkered down and put a good face on it, as much as this was possible. After all, there was a great enemy abroad. And it would take a heroic effort on the part of both individuals and societies to defeat this dragon. And some incredible things did happen. The gray polluted skies of Sao Paulo in Brazil were bright and blue again for the first time in 100 years. There's some incredible photos out there on the internet that can show you just the incredible difference between what it was before and during the lockdown. People found comfort in their small family units as they reconnected with their children and their spouses. But many, many people suffered as well. Forced isolation in a globally connected world where we are used to continual stimulation. Well, this revealed an uncomfortable emptiness at the heart of much of our lives, unfortunately. In the light of that latter reality, about a year ago, I recorded a series of videos titled Resilience and Courage in Story, where I explored the figure of Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings and showed how his example and the different traditional tales and stories that Tolkien used to tell his wonderful story of the Lord of the Rings in general, and the figure of Aragorn in particular. How these stories and these figures can help us through the heroic quest narrative, or the hero's journey, as some might call it, how to overcome the difficulties of this particular moment. Through the structures of these stories, I hope we found together meaning and strength, either to just go on, or maybe even to thrive in ways we didn't think possible. I got a lot of positive feedback about those videos. A lot of people found them to be worthwhile, and I was happy with the way they turned out. But that was last year. This year, we see an entirely different reality. No longer is there a common enemy with a single story that can unite everybody together. We have multiple stories, all of which are powerful and compelling, but in their own different ways. As Paul Kingsnorth has further argued in his wonderful series of essays titled The Abbey of Misrule, there are two now prevailing stories in the larger culture of the West as it tries to dig its way out of this pandemic. In short, these are the two stories. Story one is something you might call the plague story. Here it is. We are living through a plague, one of many in history. Our brave leaders are doing everything they can, including some frighteningly authoritarian things, as temporary measures to save us from this plague. But there is a great enemy at large. The enemy is the stupid people who refuse to listen to our brave leaders who are doing everything they can to save us. That's story number one, the plague story. Here's story number two, something we might call the story of latchkey totalitarianism. Sorry, turnkey totalitarianism, not latchkey. That's something else. Turnkey totalitarianism. Here's the story. This is not a plague. Our insidious, power-hungry leaders are doing everything they can, including some frighteningly authoritarian things, to stoke the fires of hysteria, all the while setting up an infrastructure to keep us, the free people of this land, permanently enslaved to their power-hungry whims. At any point in the near or far future, they may turn a key, and suddenly a global soft totalitarian surveillance state will dominate every aspect of our lives. So the enemy in this story is twofold. The evil cabals controlling the government of the globe, and the stupid people who refuse to consider that their leaders are the true enemy. Now, obviously, these two stories are deliberate simplifications, and they might even be slightly done for comedic effect. But I want you to notice one thing. Neither one of these stories has the same ability to unite huge amounts of people under a single banner, like it was possible maybe last year. But interestingly, that's where the power of stories really begins to show itself. In a recent and fascinating conversation, Jordan Peterson made the argument that human beings don't actually conceptualize their existence in any way other than story. Although the materialists of our time would prefer us all to think that we human beings are entirely rational creatures, in control of our minds, our bodies, our environments, the reality is quite different. In fact, we all see ourselves as characters in a story. This is visible even on the level of straight up neurobiology, science, as explained in fascinating detail by neuroscientist and self-proclaimed Darwinist, I might add, Angus Fletcher, in that same conversation with Jordan Peterson. I highly recommend you check it out. However, and here's the important question, if story is one of the most powerful influences over our lives, because we can't help but think and conceptualize ourselves in terms of story, who determines what that story is? Do we? Do we determine our own story, or do others determine it for us? How do we become aware enough of this pervasive nature of story to choose the right one for ourselves? You see, that's the important question. More quotes from Paul Kingsnorth on this matter. Here's what he had to say. This virus is apocalyptic, he says, in the sense that it is revealing things, apocalypse, revelation, revealing things previously hidden. One of these things has been the fractured nature of our stories. And that in turn has revealed just how fragile many of our societies actually are. The myth, i.e. story, of progress tells us we should have faith in certain things. Accumulated scientific knowledge, accredited and educated experts, journalists who investigate the facts of a story and then explain them to us, the human ability to establish objective truth. But the process of narrative fracture, which stems from a crisis of trust and legitimacy, means that not only do we not trust these things anymore, but we can't even agree on what many of them even mean. What is the science? Filter that in turn through the hall of mirrors that is the internet, and the stage is set for mass confusion and a consequent deepening of hostility, mistrust, and fear. This is what Kingsnorth says. See, what many people, especially those who firmly live inside the plague story that I just described, they don't understand why so many people can't just agree with the science and get along with the facts, right? They fail to recognize, though, that the facts have no meaning outside of a narrative framework. We are not factual creatures, we are story creatures. And even their trust in the science is directly related to their seeing themselves as characters in a very particular story, whether they notice it or not. Throwing facts at people who believe they're in a different story is like shooting air out of a blunderbuss. It's loud, but it's not particularly useful. Here's another great quote from Kingsnorth. Quote, human history could be seen, in fact, as a never-ending series of battles over stories, with the winners determining who shapes society, at least for a while. The ongoing culture war in many Western nations is a classic example of this narrative struggle at work. Who gets to write the story of America or Britain? Who decides if a statue stays up or what it means? The battles around these stories are so ferocious precisely because they are seen by many as existential. Because stories determine our lives. That statue, that history book, that museum display, for many people, these are not just static objects or irrelevant bits of the cultural furniture. They're symbols. The battle over which will determine who we are, whoever we are, and what we teach our children. Unquote. Recognizing that this is the case is actually quite difficult for many people because they're so firmly stuck inside a story not of their own telling. Frightening thing is that many have not chosen that story for themselves, but they assume it's the only one they can possibly inhabit. They are imprisoned in a story that others are weaving for them. This is a very dangerous way to live. Another Kingsnorth quote. While once we might have been able to cleave to a grand narrative like the story of progress, or a smaller but nonetheless unifying stories like those built around nation states, now, in this world, It is almost impossible to do this at any scale. The narratives are simply too divided. They're too fractured. Everything moves too fast, and the center will not hold. This is the meaning of the culture war, an ongoing battle over stories, with no sign at all of whether any new grand narrative will rise to replace the myth of progress. Perhaps it won't. Perhaps the days of grand narratives are simply over. Either way, the battle over stories will not end anytime soon." Unquote. I totally agree. I think the days of a single unifying story, whether for a nation or in this case, an entire globe of people besieged by a pandemic, those days are gone. Some people might be hanging by their fingertips to that reality, and it's really sad and tragic for them. But I actually see an incredible opportunity here. Because if you actually wake up to the reality of the importance of story in your own life, you can realize that you have a lot of ability to choose to shape how you tell it, to decide how that story fits your life, maybe even to find a more universal story. Again, that starts with the personal and extends all the way to the cosmic. But I am getting ahead of myself. This is the whole point of the video series I'm starting. In this series, I'll be exploring how you can use the principles of rootedness and connection to sift out the noise out in the culture, to find the true gems of story that can help you live a better, more wholehearted life. It's no longer enough to be a hero on a personal quest. Now, choosing the right kinds of story might just be a matter of life and death. I hope you'll join me as I explore the many kinds of stories available to us and how we might choose the right ones. If you find this video inspiring or interesting, please note that the rest of the video in this series will be exclusively available to the subscribers of my newsletter and the members of my Patreon community. If you'd like to join my free author newsletter, head over to nicholaskotar.com, where you will find a way to subscribe, and you'll even receive a few free gifts from me as well. And if you want to get even deeper into this with me and sit in while I record the rest of this video series, join my Patreon community. I will be recording these videos live with my patrons in an exclusive Zoom room where they will have a chance to comment and help me shape the direction of future videos. Go to patreon.com/Nicholas Kotar if you're interested. I hope to see you there.